Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 178. Harry Darby. Warning, there is information pertaining to suicide in this episode, which may be distressing. Harry Darby was born in Mansfield, Victoria in 1900, and he captured my attention as he ended his life in 1931 at the age of only 31, even though it seemed he'd set himself up for life. He enlisted in World War I on the 7th of May 1917, and his address at the time of his enlistment was at Warburton, Victoria. His next of kin was his guardian, Sister Esther, of the Diocesan Mission in Spring Street in Melbourne. It seems that Darby was brought up in a form of a foster system from a young age. However, in trying to research his biological parents, it came up with a few options but nothing definitive. There is a record in the Victorian Births, Deaths and Marriages of a Harry Darby, and his birth was registered in 1898 in Essendon. His mother is listed as Mabel Annie Darby with an unknown father, so that is quite a possibility. However, after going through the records of the state wards in Victoria around that time, I cannot find a record for a Harry Darby or a child that was born in Mansfield around 1898 to 1900 who had registered as being in the mission home in Brighton. There were also several articles that said that Harry was actually a Barnardo's boy, but there's two issues with that. First of all, the Barnardo's children, that is the children, young boys from the United Kingdom that came out to Australia, and Barnardo's was the organisation that took care of them. That scheme did not commence until 1920, so well after Harry was a child. And there is an article from a man who was a childhood friend of Harry's, and he clearly debunks the myth that he was a Barnardo's boy. He was in fact born in Victoria. In that article he states he was born in Melbourne, so there could be truth alluding to him being born of a single mother and having been given up as a state ward as a result. He actually enlisted at Claremont, Tasmania, even though his address at the time was in Warburton, Victoria, and he embarked on the Honorata from Sydney on the 14th of June 1917, reaching Liverpool, England on the 26th of August. He proceeded to France in the 10th Battalion in February 1918 and was wounded on the 29th of September 1918 with a slight gunshot wound to the left arm. He had further wounds of another gunshot in the other arm and in the left foot, and was discharged in June 1919 due to his unit being demobilised. He then joined the Russian Relief Force. Further information in his enlistment papers. On the 7th of March 1921, he stated he was born on the 4th of May 1900, and he also stated on these papers that he'd had 3 years in the Australian Naval Service and 2 years in the AIF in the 56th Battalion, but he did not state a next of kin in these papers. His address at the time of his enlistment was care of the Bank of Australasia. On the 12th of March 1921, Harry embarked on the Sire, bound for Rabaul, and on the 9th of October 1921, he was transferred to civil administration. There was an inquiry into the allegations of flogging and forced labour of natives in Papua New Guinea in May 1924, and in the inquiry, they listed all of the witnesses, and Harry Darby is listed as witness number 37 as a patrol officer and clerk, a native labour overseer at Rabaul. Harry then made his way to the Edie Creek Goldfields, and it says that a man named Wild decided to finance Bill Stour and Harry Darby on a gold-getting expedition to Edie Creek. He supplied them with 30 carriers, ample stores and equipment, and landed the party from the Emira on the Salamaua beach in July 1926. Being late arrivals at Edie Creek, they had to stake claims on the terraces well above the present creek bed. By stroke of fate, Harry pegged one of the richest areas of the field. And on the 30th of August 1928,
An article says that Mr. Harry Darby is in Sydney from the islands on a holiday. He was one of the pioneers of the Edie Creek Goldfield, and though he gives his money away as if it was the only use for it, he has accumulated enough to retire if he felt that way. But he is still a young man and will return. In the past 12 months, he has made money gifts, particularly to the Barnardo's organisation, totalling £1,000. And in the Richmond River Express and Casino Kyogle Advertiser in New South Wales on the 30th of May 1929. Imagine £1,500 a day, yet that amount recently was a one day's earning from young Harry Darby, who has pegged a claim on the Edie Goldfields in the mandated territory of New Guinea. This arresting fact, with other interesting information concerning life on the diggings, is told in a letter from Captain Ted Smith. He is a government surveyor at Edie Creek, and it was written to Mr. Pat Ryan of Murwillumbah. Captain Smith is a Murwillumbah boy. He writes, "Early this morning, one of my boys came up and called, 'Master, gold come, look him.' And so, help me goodness, there was about 50 ounces lying thick in the wash where Darby had been sluicing yesterday. He merely got a couple of dishes, shovelled the ground into them, and left them there to be sorted at his leisure." Captain Smith relates that the general opinion at Edie Creek was that if Harry were to realise all of his assets, he would be worth £50,000. The day on which Captain Smith arrived at Edie Creek, Darby washed up 616 ounces of gold, which would set the digger up for £1,506. His sole expenses a day would be 50p for labour, about 12 native boys at 4p apiece, 5% royalty to the Crown, and £4 a week for tucker. Darby never gets excited about 200 ounces a day. In fact, this is just commonplace, Captain Smith continues. And on the 5th of December 1930, another article, one of the richest claims worked by an individual miner on Edie Creek is held by Harry Darby. Mr. Roach shows the Advocate reporter snaps of scenes on the diggings. One included a photo of a big wash-up that Darby made. On the ground in front of the group of whites and blacks can be seen 6 dishes each that hold £1,000 of gold, the result of 5 weeks' work. Darby was offered £50,000 in cash and £100,000 fully paid £1 shares for his claim, but he refused. It looks like making him a millionaire. And I have a photo of that was taken in 1928, which I'll add to the Facebook post. It seems with his money that Harry Darby also bought a pub at Bululo, and he called it the Kunai Pub, and it was later transformed into the Hotel Bululo, and it was the first regular hotel in the diggings. Darby left PNG in 1930, reputedly with £100,000 in his pocket. He made his way to India, and on the 28th of March 1931, there was an article where he got himself into trouble. On the 27th of March at Madras, an Australian named Harry Darby, 31, engaged a rickshaw outside the Egmore Railway terminus and went driving. On his return, he decided that the rickshawman's fee was too high, and he drew a revolver and allegedly shot the native fatally, meaning only to threaten the man. Darby is now in custody, and it's believed that he left Sydney last year on a round-the-world trip, and that while in England he bought an aeroplane. He told the Madras authorities that he was manager of the El Dorado gold mine in New Guinea and had flown from England to India in easy stages. London reports deny any knowledge of his claim to aerial activities. And a follow-up article a few days later, Australian charged with homicide. Harry Darby, an Australian who's been charged with homicide in connection with a rickshawman's death, told the magistrate he was very, very sorry for the unfortunate accident, especially as it deprives the family of their breadwinner, and he was prepared to make restitution. It was a sheer accident, he said, and the hearing was adjourned. A fortnight later, on the 16th of April 1931, Harry Darby guilty, but free again. In Madras, Harry Darby, the wealthy Australian who shot a rickshaw puller dead last month, has been found guilty of a rash and negligent act not amounting to culpable homicide. He was sentenced to the rising of the court and fined 1,000 rupees, which amount is to be paid to the widow of the dead man. Darby was fined a further 50 rupees under the Arms Act. He paid both fines immediately and left the court. And 2 days later, rickshaw trial ends. Harry Darby, 31, an Australian tourist who shot a rickshaw puller at Egmore Railway terminus on the 27th of March, was found guilty of causing a man's death by rash and negligent act, amounting to culpable homicide, and was sentenced to imprisonment till the rising of the court. So the 1,000 rupees that he paid, which was equal to £75 in Australia at the time, was in default of 6 months imprisonment, so he paid the whole amount of the fine. Following the trial, Darby was warmly congratulated by friends. However, only a little over a month later, an article stating that there was tragedy at Seaside in Bombay. Tragedy was enacted at the Sands at Juhu, a fashionable seaside resort, yesterday morning when an Australian airman, Captain Harry Darby, who was recently before the court at Madras in connection with the shooting of a rickshaw man, according to the newspaper The Times of India, ended his life by taking a dose of strychnine. It says an equestrian saw Darby drinking the poison and, suspecting the intent, galloped to him, but it was too late to prevent the act. In a letter to the police, Darby declared his intention to commit suicide. And in the Richmond River Herald and Northern Districts Advertiser in New South Wales on the 7th of July 1931, it outlines his death in a little more detail and some of his background. Harry Darby suicides, tragic end to life of colourful adventurer. Harry Darby, who made an immense fortune out of a lucky strike on the Edie Creek Goldfields in New Guinea, is dead at the early age of 37, killed by his own hands at the sands of Colombo's most fashionable seaside resort. It's perhaps fitting that the final net of a young man who had drained the cup of life to the last dregs of incident and excitement should be a sensational exit from the world. A horseman noticed Darby taking the fatal drink and he galloped up in vain, endeavouring to knock the cup out of his hands, but Darby fell dead just as he arrived. Said to be a curious mixture of adventurer, explorer and generous giver, Darby's great driving forces in life was impulse, sometimes reckless, frequently charitable and invariably unexpected. Even in death he left a riddle, for although he addressed 2 letters, one to the coroner who would be holding the inquest and the other to the police officers, he gave no indication why he was ending his life. On the 27th of March last, after engaging a rickshaw driver at the Egmore railway terminus at Madras, Darby quarrelled with a man over the fare, which he thought was exorbitant. After a few heated words, it was 11 p.m, he drew an automatic and shot the rickshaw driver dead. He claimed the gun had gone off accidentally, but was sentenced to the rising of the court and fined for being in possession of cartridges in excess of the prescribed limit. He had his licence also suspended. He told the police he was the owner of the El Dorado gold mine in New Guinea and that he'd flown in from stages from England, arriving in India on the 26th of January. After being at Madras some time, he travelled a good deal in India and reached Bombay 2 months ago. Although he had few friends there, he lived on a lavish scale, always travelling by car. He'd been living at the Juhu Hotel. Only a few years ago, Darby drifted penniless but cheerfully to the New Guinea goldfields, where he was popular, persevering and always ready to give any new venture a fly. He struck gold at Edie Creek and shortly after found himself with more money he knew how to handle. Before setting out on his extended world tour last year, he gave amazingly generous gifts to all those who had stood by him and paid for a new wing in the institution that he was brought up in as a child. In England, he brought a Moth aeroplane which he flew by easy stages to India. Those who knew Darby in Sydney and at New Guinea say that he was reckless, restless, venturesome, but very likeable. Striking gold in sufficient quantities to make him fabulously wealthy, he was enabled to indulge in his fondness for the unusual and will leave many kindly recollections. He was a bachelor and is believed to have served as a mere boy in the AIF. In the Burnie Advocate, a newspaper in Tasmania on the 16th of July 1931, titled Won and Spent a Fortune, Tragic Death of New Guinea's Luckiest Prospector. When the story of gold in New Guinea comes to be told, its dramatic persona will be equally impressive. Not at the least, the extraordinary of characters who will appear in that history will be Harry Darby, the digger who met his death at his own hands on a beach at Bombay recently. Darby, whether penniless, he knew grinding poverty at its worst in a land where poverty was a crime, or rolling in wealth, as he was reported to have been in recent years, was always the same to the people of New Guinea, and probably to everybody else. According to the cable message which announced his suicide, he was Captain Harry Darby. Few of his old associates in the inlands were aware of his military title, or indeed any other title. He was not even Mr. He was just plain Darby to every white man in New Guinea, and Master Darby to every native who knew him. He fought with the AIF and found his way eventually to the islands. In the mandated territory for a time, he held a comparatively humble post in charge of the government labour line in Rabaul, and he was, I believe, the interpreter of pidgin English in the courts. It was not long before the gold rush at Edie Creek occurred when the famous Big Six, headed by Bill Royal after having endured terrible privations in the fever-stricken Morobe jungle, eluding suspicious, cowardly natives, and existing at the last on a diet of rice and water, struck gold in the Bulula area in the mainland of New Guinea. Darby was early on the scene. How he reached it, the stories are many, but only one of them can be true. Some say that he stowed away on a steamer of Buras, Philp and Company. Others declare that a generous skipper helped him. Others assert that he was grub-staked, which means that he was furnished with funds to be able to go and commence mining in shares with another man or a company. And others say that he just went. At any rate, he is said to have been utterly without resources when he reached the field, after having walked, climbed, crawled and waded for 8 or 9 days over the terrible track that lies between the beach of Salamua and the Muddy Creek, the other side of mountains 10,000 foot high, which was destined to make him affluent. The journey is now made by aeroplane. When I visited the field 3 years later, a hole in the ground was pointed out to me, and they said Darby took £50,000 out of that. What's troubling him is that under his house, beside the mine, there is probably upwards of £50,000 more. A man hates to part with the old home, you know. The old home was the usual decrepit shack found at Bululo, on its last legs before the roof was up. It was on the administrator's yacht, in the Sapphire Harbour at Salamoa, in the gold of a tropic dawn, that I met Darby. 6 months' growth of beard and a tousled mat of hair were my first impressions as he mounted the gangway, clad in torn shorts and a shirt of khaki, both due for attentions of the wash-boy. He wore no socks and his feet were in dilapidated deck shoes. His sleeves were rolled up as if for manual labour, but his entire luggage, a tin of cigarettes, was borne by a muscular Madang boy. "Where's the blip government?" demanded Darby at the top of his voice. "I want a blip dog licence." Government was the administrator. Notwithstanding the casual tone in which he sought it, I heard subsequently that his interview with the administrator was highly successful and was of mutual advantage. It concerned something a great deal more important than a dog licence. I met Darby again on his way back. "Writing a book, aren't you?" he said, more in sorrow than in anger, after the manner of the average resident of New Guinea, who takes it for granted that every newcomer is, as a matter of course, writing a book. "I've heard about you. Come and have a drink." We had a drink at the store on the beach. He ordered a case of beer, extracted a bottle, which, with the aid of a couple of glasses borrowed on the spot, "Send the rest up," he ordered. I learned that it was not uncommon for Darby to have the other 311 bottles sent up to his house. In Rabaul, Darby's generosity was a byword. Every charity owes something to his purse, including the famous Tongas, the Territory of New Guinea Aid Society, which finances out of the country those whose vanished resources renders their continued presence in a black man's country something of a menace to white prestige. He gave lavishly to the sporting associations in the Territory. Almost his first action on reaping the reward of his labours at Edie Creek, he was to send a cheque to the home that he grew up in as a young boy. Darby, now a rich man, took a holiday in Sydney, and soon rumours began to drift back to the field. Darby had a secretary. Darby has given a cheque for £1,000 to his old friend Captain, and it was left blank. Darby was wearing a 20 guinea suit but no socks. Darby had given away a priceless rope of pearls. Darby had bought a triple-engine Junkers airliner to run between Salamau and Edie Creek. Darby had invested £50,000 in gilt-edged securities. Darby had acquired a plantation. Darby had gone to Canberra and told them what he thought of them. These and 1,000 other stories filtered through, some of them possibly true enough, and all of them were possible, for Darby was that sort of fellow. I met him in Sydney. He was wearing the 20 guinea suit, but an artistic unconcern for the conventions generally characterised for the remainder of his garb. A little later I heard that he was ill, and he was the despair of the staff in the hospital at Mascot, in which he was a rather restless patient. The neighbouring aerodrome proved too attractive for Darby and a mate who occupied the bed next to him. They made a practice of slipping out for a flight to Sydney as a sort of appetiser before breakfast. Recovered again, he was off on the visit to Europe, in returning from which with an aeroplane which he purchased in London. Darby was in Madras. Considering himself unfairly treated by a rickshawman he'd hired, he flourished a revolver at him. The firearm exploded and the man was killed. Darby, absolved of the blame by the coroner, indemnified the relatives of the man he'd killed as well as he could for their loss. What happened then, who can tell? Did he brood upon the effects of his hasty action? Did some conviction of capriciousness of destiny, the vanity of riches, seize hold upon his impressionable brain? He keeps his secret. New Guinea is a land for strong men. In its jealous, secret fastedness in the air is poison for the man whose soul is too sensitive. Melancholia awaits the temperamental in those island outposts. On the way to the goldfields, I was shown the fresh mound that covered a digger who, while apparently awaiting the aeroplane, which was to take him and his hard-won wealth back to civilization, had blown his brains out with a shotgun. None knew why. At Talisea, an imposing tomb on a grass-covered hillside above the government station houses, the remains of a soldier of high rank, one of the bravest of men, who looked one down for the last time on the steaming soil of that sinister, brooding hill, and then walked away and ended his life. None knew why. In an island home of fairy beauty, a bower in the equatorial jungle, I was one of a party which saved a lone planter at the 11th hour from a dreadful death from poison, which he had administered to himself. He too seemed to be a normal individual, with little reason to hasten death. The newspapers a few weeks ago chronicled the death in Sydney from an overdose of drug of a man from New Britain whose melancholy on an isolated plantation had driven him to desperation. The tale of tragedy is a long tale. The tropics are not for the unbalanced. Was Darby one of these? I do not know, but I liked him. And in the Sydney Smith's Weekly on the 15th of August 1931, Dead Man's Bet led to a fortune, how Harry Darby founded his riches, one of the world's adventurers. Who has not heard of the red-haired and freckle-faced young man Harry Darby, most spectacular figure of the New Guinea goldfields, who suicided on the beach at Bombay a couple of months ago? At various times newspapers have referred to Darby's prodigal spending of his enormous wealth, but it was a strange story of how this blasé youthful adventurer made his lucky strike on the Edie Creek fields that's been known to few. A crude cross, roughly engraved with ill-spelt lettering, marks the gap in the stormy career of Harry Darby. It bridges the period between his poverty and his riches. The cross identifies the grave of his friend Bill Hart, another youthful seeker of adventure and the closest friend that Darby had made in his lonely, erratic life. For Darby was nothing if not lonely. Even when his mines commenced to pour out their seemingly endless stream of gold, he had no intimates. He enlisted in the AIF at the age of 15. He had no parents or relatives to worry about, and somewhere in France he was wounded with a bullet which lodged in his stomach. And it says, erected by Darby in memory of my old cobber, Bill Hart, who died on the 7th of April 1922. Thus reads a simple cross which Darby fashioned for his dead friend's grave. A nurse who was then attached to the Namanula Hospital in New Guinea recalls the passing of Bill Hart and the easy disregard of hospital regulations by Darby to be near his cobber until the finish. It was the first time that I ever saw Darby, she informed Smith's Weekly. No one knew then that this strange, lonely young chap would become the wealthiest man in the whole of the New Guinea group. I first saw him standing in the isolation ward. He was beside the bed of young Hart, who was dying with blackwater fever. I got a shock when I noticed Harry Darby because he had no right to be there. Oh, what the hell does it matter, he replied carelessly. Bill reckons he's got to go, so I know he would like me to be here to look on. Darby yarned to me, and it was useless to try and ask him to leave the ward while his friend was dying. He told me he couldn't remember his father or mother. I was interested in Darby's calm way of reciting some of his adventures. He had returned from the war through Russia and had spent 6 months in Archangel, and he related startling experiences with a disinterested air which left me amazed. Just then I noticed that poor Bill Hart was dying and wanted to say something to me. I leant over him. "Nurse," he whispered, "I owe Harry something for a bet. Will you see that it's fixed up?" That was all. Bill Hart died. He turned up in a small settlement north of Namanula. I found out the extent of the debt. It was £9, and a brigadier, General Wisdom, paid it over to him. Darby took the £9 and said cheerio, headed for the Edie Creek and fortune. Darby and Bill Hart had been gambling in the Canton Cafe in New Guinea's Chinatown. Bill had gone broke there and Harry Darby had paid his betting losses. The repayment of the gambling debt was the slender basis on which his wealth was built. But he remained a lonely figure in spite of his wealth. In London he threw his money about recklessly, but made no intimate friends, and crossed to Monte Carlo, where he lived as though there could never be an end to his wealth. He secured a pilot's licence and formed a wild idea of flying to Australia, but got as far as Bombay when the incident occurred which hastened the end of his spectacular career. In New Guinea his mines still gushed their golden stream of wealth. And in the Northern Miner at Charters Towers in Queensland on the 28th of August 1931, Harry Darby, new light on strange career. Stories of the generosity of Harry Darby, the New Guinea gold miner, whose romantic life and tragic death were the subject of a sketch in the camera supplement of the Melbourne Argus recently, are told by a correspondent from Warburton who writes that he knew Darby well from childhood. The correspondent states that he was born in Melbourne, and in very early childhood he came under the care of the Sisters of the Diocesan Mission to the streets and lanes of Melbourne. He was sent to the babies' home at Brighton. Just before setting out on his last tragic journey, he visited this institution, and in remembrance of what it had done for him, he entertained the little inmates and left a substantial cheque. At the age of about 9 years, he went to live at Warburton with a family to whom he had been boarded out. There he lived several years, a happy-go-lucky daredevil, generous, mischievous, and a lovable boy. Later he moved with the same family to Ferntree Gully. After having left school, he was employed in farms in the Alexandra district and at Flinders Island. From Flinders Island, when he was 17, he enlisted in the Tasmanian Battalion and served in France until the armistice. After he held a position in the Corps in England for some time until he obtained his discharge from the AIF so that he might join the expedition of the Imperial forces to northern Russia against the Bolsheviks. Darby returned to Australia and went to Warburton and worked for a brief time at a sawmill. He engaged a member of a survey party and reached Rabaul, where he later entered the government service. He remained in the service and paid one visit to Australia on furlough in that time. He left this post to go to the Edie Creek Goldfield. I am in possession of letters describing the journey, his life at Bullulo, and his rise to fortune, writes the correspondent from Warburton. The stories of his generosity could be multiplied. He came with a party of childhood friends, whom he never forgot, to Warburton just before he left for Europe. He said he would return at the end of this year. What led to his tragic death when he was approaching the last stage of his 2 years of travel, I cannot conjecture. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Harry Darby. Despite the sad ending, he had a wonderful life full of adventure and a keen stroke of luck.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.